The craft of directing for film is practiced in many different ways. Over the past couple of years, many great directors have sat at this table and talked about what the process is for them.
Directing is not totally an understood process. Directing is more like being a kind of impresario, is that you set the conditions by which the performance will happen. You try to set them in a situation where everything will work right for them.
I mean, in Raging Bull, the fight scenes were envisioned and drawn on paper by me as if they were bars of music. In other words, let's say 5 or 6 punches became 2 bars of music. And I covered those 5 or 6 punches in one shot. In other words, we didn't shoot 7 cameras and do it later in the editing. Right. It was shot 1, which covered the first 5, 6 punches, to shot 2, which covers the reaction to one of those punches, track around this way, and you cut the 2 shots together and you have the flow. And it was like dancing.
I like the idea of going down in, and everybody is like that. Everybody is a detective. The unknown is a magnet, and you can learn many, many things by going down in there. And but it doesn't negate a bright road either. Film is made up of contrasts, and knowledge and experience of combined opposites is sort of what it's all about. Yeah,
novelists have always had just a complete freedom to pretty much tell their story any way they saw fit. All right, and that's kind of what I'm trying to do. Now the thing is, for both novels and film, 75% of the stories you're going to tell will work better on a dramatic basis, on a dramatically engaging basis, to be told from a linear way. But there is that 25% out there that, can be more resonant by telling it this way. And I think in the case of both Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction, it gains a lot more resonance being told in this kind of wild way.
Some directors learn their craft in film school. Some learn by getting out there and making a film. Peter Bogdanovich acquired his knowledge straight from the mouths of the filmmakers he admired. Before he became the director of films like The Last Picture Show, Paper Moon, and Mask, he was writing on film for Esquire and other magazines. The interviews he did with filmmakers like Alfred Hitchcock, John Ford, and Orson Welles influenced a generation. His new book, Who the Devil Made It, is a collection of his interviews with some of the greatest directors in cinema history, and I am very pleased to have Peter Bogdanovich at this table. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
It's really great to have you here.
Thank you.
Let me talk a little bit about you before we start talking about other people. I mean, you came to this craft of directing in a circuitous way. Tell me what it was when you were doing the interviews, when you were out talking to these people and doing the monogram for the for MoMA.
Yeah.
Did you always say, in the end, I'm learning because I want to do it?
Exactly. That was at least 50% of the reason I did the interviews. I mean, there was always some other reason, but usually that was dominated in my mind anyway. I wanted to find out what these people were like. I wanted to find out how they did it. It was really like storing nuts for the winter, when I get to direct. And in some cases, I already was directing by the time I asked the questions. In fact, the first interview I ever did, which is the last interview in the book with Sidney Lumet, I had already directed in the theater. So I knew, working with actors, I'd studied acting. So I never was an academician. I never really was a critic asking questions. I was, kind of an apprentice director or a pro who wanted to know more. And that was the basic reason for all the questions.
What turned you on to directing?
I don't know. I was trying to figure that out. I think it's because I love acting, and I thought, well, gee, maybe I can play all the parts by directing, and it didn't work out that way. But one of my regrets is that I haven't acted more. But that was the only thing I ever studied formally was acting, and then I put myself through my own kind of university training by talking to these great directors.
Yeah. Who did you have the greatest friendship with?
Of these directors?
Yeah.
Well, I would think Hawks, although he was a very, he was a kind of aloof, Howard Hawks. He had cold blue eyes, and you couldn't get real close to him, but he was very, he was wonderful with me, and he was full of stories and very encouraging and funny. Alan Dwan, who's the oldest director in the book, who started directing in 1910, who was the man who was partially responsible, quite a bit responsible, for making Douglas Fairbanks a star, who directed Gloria Swanson, some of her greatest pictures, who directed John Wayne in Sands of Iwo Jima. This man was sitting in little house in the valley in Los Angeles, you know, the last pioneer, I call him, and he was. He'd seen it all come and go, you know, and there he was in this room. He was such a jolly man and so sweet and kind.
Let me come back to your talent. Who the Devil Made It. You, Henry Jaglom, Warren Beatty are together.
Yeah.
And that's the genesis of this book?
No, that was just the beginning. That's the introduction where I talk about seeing Warren at Henry's party that Henry was throwing, and Warren said, you know, what happened? He says, you know, nothing matters much anymore, does it? I mean, John Ford, who's he? Elia Kazan, who's he? He said, geez, he says, everybody's dead. And I knew exactly what he meant because Kazan isn't dead. He's quite active, but
somebody I really want to do on this
yeah,
program.
he was an interesting director. But I knew what he meant. You know, Warren and I came into the business as rather young men, very young men, in what was then an old man's business.
Yeah. The giants were old.
The giants were all old and still working, but, you know, they were all, I mean, when I met John Ford, he was 69. When I met Howard Hawks the first time, he was 65, you know. And now, Warren and I are older men in what has become a young man's business, and it's quite different.
What is the difference between the directors of today and the directors of yesterday?
The big difference, Charlie, the big difference, strangely enough, you'd be surprised, is that the older directors all started with silent movies. They grew up, two things, they grew up not necessarily wanting to be movie makers because there was no such thing as movies when they first, I mean, Alan Dwan was born in 1885. That was full 10 years before movies ever were shown. So they had a life experience. A lot of these directors, like Raoul Walsh was a sailor, Fritz Lang was an architect, Hitchcock was a mechanical engineer, Dwan was a football star and an engineer, Otto Preminger and Leo McCarey were lawyers. None of them thought, I'm going to be a movie director when I grow up. They had other life experiences, and those life experiences enriched their work. That's one thing. The other thing is that the silent era, where the image was everything, where everything was done through images, that was the attempt. Yeah. There was no dialogue, so plot was conveyed through images, nuances of character, motivations, all that the attempt wasn't always successful, but the attempt was, let's do this visually. How do we tell this visually? And all those directors who started in the silent era, most of them continued into the sound era up into the 60s and late 60s. So they brought that sense of the foundation of the business, which was this image. They brought that into their talkies. Today, I mean, you say to some young kid, you ought to see some silent movies. Are you kidding? I mean, you can hardly get kids to see black and white, much less silent movies. But the foundation of the art is in silent movies. So if you leave that out, you're stuck with what Hitchcock used to say is pictures of people talking.
All right, speaking of Hitchcock, tell me about, I want to go through a series of these because we got a series of, from Hitchcock, Hawks, Cukor, Lang, and Lumet, and talk about them individually, and we'll show a piece of their work. Right. Hitchcock first. Tell me about it.
Well, I mean, Hitch loved to tell you about how he did it. He'd love it. I mean, it was his main thing. He didn't want to talk about the meaning of it, but he loved to tell you how he did it. So the first time I met him was just about a year after Psycho had opened. And I said, so how did you do the shower scene? He said, well, he says, the Paramount Special Effects Department made me a torso entirely of rubber. You plunged a knife in, and blood would spurt out. Oh, it was wonderful. I didn't use it at all. I said, you didn't use it? No, not at all. That's cheating. And then he went on to explain to me that what he'd done is cheating. What he had done was, he referred to it as pure cinema, which is little tiny bits of film put together that are meaningless by themselves, but when put together they create a different message. So if you look at that shower scene, he told me this, there are 70 different camera setups, 70 different camera positions that you're seeing in 45 seconds.
70 different?
Yeah, camera positions in 45 seconds. And that's how the illusion that she's being stabbed to death happens. She actually, the knife never touches the body. That's what's interesting about it.
Wow.
So that's Hitchcock. And he loved to deal with, you know, I said to him once, is it true, Hitch, that you said actors are cattle? He said, no, I said they should be treated like cattle.
That's great. All right, this is a scene on a carousel with an actor endangering himself under it. Set this up for me. you know what I'm talking about?
Well, it's the scene on the final scene on the in Strangers on a Train when they're wrestling on the merry-go-round, and Hitch was always very concerned because the little man who crawled underneath to turn the thing off, who was the kind of the caretaker or something, was an actor. And Hitch said he was terrified that something would happen to this guy. He says, my palms sweat when I think about it, because he said that was real. That thing was really spinning.
He could have been hurt.
He could have
Roll
been hurt.
tape. Here it is. Strangers on a Train, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. You see that and you say what? What's the genius there?
Well, it's all, you know, it's storytelling, beautiful storytelling without you noticing how he did it, you know. All those little pieces of film put together is...
We've mentioned Howard Hawks bringing up baby Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, searching for a bone the dog has buried. But set up Howard Hawks for me, because you were closest to him.
In a way I was, you know, and I knew him, and it's the longest interview in the book. And he was a very complicated guy. I said somewhere, and I'm not the only one who said it, that he was the most American of all the directors.
More than Ford.
Well, yes, in a way, because he covered... Ford, you know, was basically associated with Westerns. He did make other kinds of films, and some great ones, and war films. But Hawks did everything. He did musical, Gentlemen Prefer Blonde, he did comedies like His Girl Friday and Bringing Up Baby, he did Westerns like Rio Bravo and Red River. I mean, he did so many different kinds of genres, and he also was kind of from the Midwest. He was a rich kid, you know. He was very well educated and very cool, you know. And Don Siegel, another director in the book, said that he watched all the directors at Warner Brothers, because he was in the montage department at Warner Brothers, and he said of all the directors, when you walked on the set, Howard Hawks was the one you say, that's the director. He looked like a director.
He looked like he was the guy who ran things.
Yes, and he was so cool, you know.
Siegel directed Clint Eastwood, didn't he?
And Dirty Harry, exactly.
Roll tape, Howard Hawks, Katharine Hepburn, and Cary Grant.
Dick.
I'm digging.
Oh, I feel something. I feel
Oh, I
something.
hope it didn't hurt.
That movie was a failure in its time.
Yes, isn't that amazing? That was not a successful picture.
Howard Hawks, The Imitation to do of him.
Well, what was funny is, you know, he had this very particular way of talking, but who knows how Howard Hawks talks? I mean, you know, I could be talking like anybody.
Nobody else
you
knew him,
know. Right, but Cary Grant, who did 5 pictures with him, and I knew Cary for a number of years, he heard me do it once, and he just, every time I spoke to him for about 15 years, he would say, come on now, do Howard for me, do Howard for me, come on. And I'd say, well, Cary, and I'd think, my God, that sounds just like Howard.
Yeah. Cary Grant made himself into Cary Grant. He created this character in his head.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Charlie. I'm doing, my next book is going to be about actors, called Who the Hell's in It? And I'm going to get into this. But Cary Grant, really, his movie personality was made up of a number of different directors who kind of led him in certain ways. I mean, for example, he did one picture with Joseph von Sternberg, who's in my book.
Right.
And he came on the set. I said to Cary, I said, did von Sternberg direct you much? No, didn't say much to me. He was talking about Marlena. It didn't say much to me. I said, well, what did he say to you? He only said one thing to me. I said, what? He said, your hair's parted on the wrong side. I said, so what'd you do? Well, I parted it on the other side and kept it that way the rest of my career.
So he was a...
Interesting, huh?
Yeah.
Then Leo McCarey, who's in my book. Leo McCarey wanted Cary Grant to play something different than he'd ever done before in a movie called The Awful Truth.
Yeah.
And Cary Grant was so afraid of where Leo McCarey was pushing him that he offered Harry Cohen $5,000 to buy his way out of the picture and let somebody else replace him.
Because it would ruin the image he had created of Cary Grant.
He didn't have an image. That's what's so funny. He was an actor who had been in pictures for 7 years, been a sort of a second-rate star, but didn't have a breakthrough picture. And guess what? That one, which Harry Cohen said, keep your $5,000, get the hell back on the set, that's the picture that made him a star. The Awful Truth. And Cary Grant was one of the smartest actors I knew. So it's interesting that he wasn't aware of what was going to happen to him.
Do you think most actors are smart?
You put me on the spot there, Charlie. I think they're, you know, actors, there's so many different actors, you can't.
Oh, come on, don't back off. I mean, I've had one director after another come here and say they're like children.
They often are. Hitch said that. He said they're like children. He said sometimes they have to be coddled, and sometimes they have to be spanked.
But you could also say the same thing about artists. You could say the same thing about a lot of other people who have to put everything out there to be graded, judged, touched.
Well, you know, the actors want to, particularly today, want to be versatile. And, you know, a person who plays comedy wants to say, hey, I can do Hamlet, And a person who does Hamlet wants to say, hey, I can do comedy. But that may not be what would be best for them, and it may not be what the public wants to see them do. So, you know, it's difficult to decide as an actor what's the best thing for you to do. And that's one of the problems today, I think, is that actors have too much to say about what they're doing. Hawks...
They have too much to say about what they're doing?
Yeah.
I mean, they're too involved in their life and their career?
No, it's just that they don't have objectivity.
You really do long for, in part, an older time in Hollywood?
I do, because I think it was
where the systems were strong and the directors...
Yeah, because, you see, everybody was under contract. Hawks said a line in the book, he says, you know, in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, he said, we had the greatest array of stars in the history of the world, and very few of them had anything to say about what they were going to do. Now that's unfortunately accurate.
I rest my case, he would say. Yeah, there's a great story about Clark Gable. Who told you this story? Clark Gable and William Faulkner.
Yeah, it's in there.
Yeah, I know.
Hawks told me that.
Yeah. Faulkner's on the set.
It was early in the 30s. No, they went on a hunting trip.
Right, that's right. Yeah.
And Gable turned to Faulkner and said, they were talking about writing or something, writers. And he said, well, Gable said, who do you think are the 5 best writers, Mr. Faulkner? And Faulkner said, and I don't have all the names, he said Willa Cather and Thomas Mann and myself. Yeah. And Gable said, oh, do you write, Mr. Faulkner? And Faulkner said, yes. And what do you do, Mr. Gable?
That's okay. Next is George Cukor, Little Women. Set this up for me. The scene actually is...
Well, this is the original Little Women.
Yeah. Yes, that's right. This is not the Winona Ryder version.
No, or the Janet Leigh version. Yeah. This is the one that was made in 1933. It was a very big success. And Katharine Hepburn plays Jo.
Right. Here it is. Roll tape.
The doctor said it was scarlet fever. Scarlet fever, Hannah.
Finally, I want to get through this because these are the people here. If you look at this list, Robert Aldrich, George Cukor, Alan Dwan, Howard Hawks, Alfred Hitchcock, Chuck Jones, Fritz Lang, Joseph Lewis, Sidney Lumet, Leo McCarey, Otto Preminger, Don Siegel, Joseph von Sternberg, Frank Tashlin, Edgar Ulmer, and Raoul Walsh. Next is Sidney Lumet, still working, still alive.
Still has 2 pictures coming out, yeah.
What do you like about his career and his work? And
I like the integrity that he's kept in his career and the fact that he's stayed on the East Coast.
That's what I was going to say, stayed on the East Coast.
Stayed on the East Coast, which at a time when, you know, nobody was staying on the East Coast, he did, and I think he's led the way for a lot of other people who are now staying.
Coming back here.
Well, I am. I just moved back to the East Coast.
Why?
Well, I'd like to make some pictures on this coast, and I'd like to do some stuff in Europe, so I'm just going to be closer this way.
This is 12 Angry Men, when one of the jurors begins a tirade against the defendant. Here it is.
They get drunk. Oh, they're real big drinkers, all of them. You know that. And bang, someone's lying in the gutter.
What do we learn from that, looking at that?
Well, that was all one shot that started close on Ed Begley and pulled back.
Yeah.
Now, we were talking about it, 12 Angry Men is almost, you could use it as a textbook of how to make a picture. I mean, here's this...
One room.
Here's 12 men in one room,
right.
You know, and it works. Yeah. And why does it work? First of all, he had superb actors, good script. And also he knew where to put the camera. He knew how to alternate the shots. He knew when to use a close-up and when not to use a close-up. He knew when to use a 2-shot. He knew when, you know, it's beautifully done, beautifully done. And the other thing, also he knows how to talk to actors, which is what Cukor knew. Yeah. You know, you have to trust the director. There's a great line of Cagney's, who had a kind of maxim for how to good movie acting. He said, look in the other actor's camera eye.
Yeah.
And tell the truth.
Yes.
So, you know, the eye closest to the camera brings the lens close, you know, brings it close to the lens. But both Lumet and Cukor, Sidney started as an actor. George started as a director in the theater here in New York. Both of them had a real rapport with actors, and both of them created an atmosphere in which the actors told the truth, in which they felt that they could tell the truth to this guy. You know, Sidney has a wonderful way of talking with actors, as George did. You know, honey, sweetie, baby, it's very New York theatrical, but you trust him, you like him.
It's like a tennis coach.
I actually worked for Sidney as a bit player in a live TV show many years ago. And I watched him, and, you know, he was all over the place, very energetic, very involved.
Woody Allen uses a lot of set shots.
He does a lot of things without a cut.
Yeah, without a cut, exactly.
Without a cut.
Now, is he a
I
great
rather
director?
like that. I think Woody's a hell of a good director.
Among other things,
I think only posterity can say who's great, but I think he's one of the fine directors we have.
He had a signature. He has a signature. Somebody in this book said the problem with directors today is that there's no signature.
Well,
or they said a director should have, you should be able to look at a picture.
Well, that's where I got the title. Howard Hawks said that to me. He said, you know, I asked him, what directors over the years have you liked best? And he said, I like those directors that made me know who the devil was making the picture. Because the director's the storyteller, and he ought to have his own way of telling it.
You know what you ought to do? I'm giving you a little career advice.
Okay, go and do it.
This is true, Peter. You ought to do a one-man thing. You know how they used to do those things, one-man thing, Truman and Roosevelt and others? Yeah. You ought to get on stage.
Yeah.
And talk about film using all the voices and all the characters.
Be fun.
You ought to do that. I mean, it's a great...
have a seminar.
Because you have the voice, and you've captured it, and you know the dialogue because you've got it on paper.
Yeah.
You could create a great one-man piece.
It's a very good
It'll
idea.
It'll be 10%.
Okay,
Peter?
Send it to you.
Speaking of that, accept my premise. Last Picture Show, Paper Moon, some of those early films, they said Bogdanovich is the best we've got. He's on his way. They don't say that anymore.
Some do. The enlightened ones.
What happened?
Well, life got in the way. You know that story of John Lennon's. You know,
yeah, exactly.
The song, you know, life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. You know, we haven't got enough time for me to tell you everything that happened, but a lot of things happened. I was in love with Dorothy Stratton. She got murdered. That put a big hole in my life for a number of years, and took me quite a long time to recover from that. And then I got in some beefs with producers and executives that who were not happy with me, and who did not make my life easy. I had a couple of movies, I don't want to say which ones now, but I don't need to get more trouble, but I've had a number of pictures that were sabotaged in distribution, which, you know, pictures that could have reached the audience, but for one reason or another, they just didn't.
Okay. But you were here to say
that I'm ready to make some more pictures.
No, but before we say that, are you here to say that you haven't lost it, you know, that what you had in Last Picture Show, especially, because it was the first thing that grabbed our attention, you haven't lost that at all?
No, in fact, I've got 2 films in the can I'm rather proud of that are going to be on television. One is a cable thing I did for Showtime about 2 Catholic women who saved Jews during World War II, called Rescuers, 2 women, which Streisand produced, which will be on in November, I think.
I want to pursue this. Now, I take the Stratton and understand. I once met Dorothy Stratton and interviewed her, and she was stunning. I understood how you could be so madly and deeply in love with her. In Texas, when I was doing a show, she was there, and I interviewed her. I understand that, but other than that, you know, I'm fascinated by someone who has the skills that you have. You could argue about Orson Welles as well. And I never quite understood why he could never, and a lot of other people thought about that, including you, a lot more than I have.
Yeah.
What is it?
Well, you know, I've said before that success, was it Tennessee Williams who called it the catastrophe of success? Because success is much more difficult to handle than failure, and you can get led into a lot of different directions. I made a number of mistakes, listening to this person, listening to that person, not following my own road. You know, you can get going on the wrong path, and then it's hard to get back on the right one. And it becomes a circuitous route.
Because they say Peter Bogdanovich, and they say, he's...
Whatever, not him, whatever it is, you know. And so it becomes more of a struggle. But, you know, I've been working the last few years. I've done 4 things for television in the last 3 years that I rather like. I like working quickly. I've got some things I'm preparing. I'm going to Cannes to shoot the background for a little movie we're going to make.
About Cannes? A documentary type little movie?
No, not a movie about picture people at Cannes, yeah.
Kind of the Players at Cannes type thing?
Yeah, that's right.
Is that right?
It's sort of like The Player, but it's not a murder story, but it's about picture people. And I'm going to do that. And then I've got a really exciting ghost picture I've been working on for about 15 years. It's a comedy about ghosts, not only about ghosts, but it's about a bunch of show business people whose lives are invaded by ghosts. And I'm very interested in ghosts.
Imagine my surprise.
Anyway, so that's another thing, and I've got a bunch of things I'm working on. In fact, to tell you the truth, I'm more anxious now to make pictures than I ever was, and I think
You're hungrier too.
I'm hungrier, and also I think better at it.
Why better at it?
Well, I think I've learned a lot about the job, and I think I know how to do. Listen, I just did this thing in 19 days for Showtime. There ain't no way I could have done that 20 years ago. 19 days, no way. You know, you have to have a little bit of. You know, my chops are still in very good shape.
Who the Devil Made It, a collection of interviews and also comment by Peter Bogdanovich, who understands the craft of directing and has practiced it well. I thank you. Pleasure
Thank
to
you,
have you
Charlie.
here.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.